Welcome back, friends, to another edition of LandO's Lock-ins, the series in which we do our darndest, our best to try to make the most accurate CDL pick'em predictions possible. If you're looking for CDL pick'ems, if you're looking for someone to summarize the week ahead, you're in the right place. You're in the right place, my friend. If this is your first time tuning in, I welcome you. If you've been watching this series for a while, I welcome you the same. It is going to be a phenomenal week. We enter into week number 2 of our final split of the season here at Major 4, all in preparation for New York, but just in general, it is all in preparation for Champs, the event at the end of the season. Everybody is in a mad dash to try to get into that top 8 to solidify their spot in the Champs. If you're in the bottom 4, you're not going to Champs. It is all on the line. Constant teams are on the bubble trying to make sure they can stay in the top 8. Everybody in the bottom 4 is doing everything, moving hell and high water, making roster changes after roster change, trying to get into the top 8. It has been a blast to watch it. It's been a blast to cast it. It's been a blast to cover it for you guys as well. Like I said, if it's your first time, this is where we make our pick'em predictions. It's where we go over stuff. It's where we talk as a community in the chat. We go over our predictions together, and it's a great time. You guys are always awesome. There are some people who like to leave their predictions in the comments of this video. It is so much fun to see what your guys' thoughts are, and even on some of the topics that I talk about. I had some people saying, like, Landon, you are crazy, right? When it comes down to LA Thieves beating Atlanta FaZe, there is no way that's going to happen. And you guys were absolutely right. Let's take a look at our predictions from last week. Subpar at best. I mean, 5-5 again. We expect better, right? For somebody who has this trophy from last year, you got to do better. You got to do better, simply put. And there were some that obviously, messed me up quite a bit. The 2 OpTic losses were obviously, are quite hurtful. The Atlanta FaZe LA Thieves pick, I had LAT taking that. It looked great, except for the search destroys, because LA Thieves decided to just not practice search destroy anymore. I had Minnesota actually Florida beating Minnesota originally, and I changed it last second, and I'm ticked off about that. And then what was the other one that we had? Oh yeah, London and Toronto. I called out how that very well could be a London W, but I decided to go with my gut and pick the Ultra, and boy, was the gut wrong. All right, so this is the slate of matches that we've got. 10 great games to look forward to when it comes down to week number 2 of our Major 4 qualifiers. A big week for roster change teams, right? This is gonna be their second week to be able to play together. We've been able to have a decent sample size of where everybody sits, and there is a roster change going down with one of our teams. In fact, OpTic Texas, if you've not already seen it, iLLeY is going to be back. At least that's the way it sounds. There's always updates, always things going on the timeline, but as of the recording of this video, it appears that iLLeY will be playing in both of the matches for OpTic Texas this week. They find themselves in an 0-2 hole. They need to win all 3 games to guarantee a winner's bracket spot, and like I said, they've got a very interesting game, especially at the end of the week, that I cannot wait to talk about. Now, if you guys are also interested, you can feel free to check out the timestamps listed in the video. You can go down to the comments, or the description rather, or you can just, as you scroll throughout the video, on the progress bar, whatever it's called, you can go to specific matchups as well if you'd like to watch it that way. If you're like, hey, I'd rather see, how my London Royal Ravens are doing. What does Landon think about the Paris versus Thieves game, New York versus Surge, etc. You can feel free to skip throughout the video, or if you would listen to the whole thing, you can feel free to do that as well. We greatly appreciate everybody who listens to the end of the video. If you've not done so already, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, and let us get into our very first series. Toronto versus Atlanta, Ultra versus FaZe, one of the classic matchups that we've had over the past 2 seasons in the CDL. Given how Toronto looked in Cold War, they've started to reach back into that form, ladies and gentlemen. They have finally started to get back into that form. But after week 1, I don't know, right? It is an interesting time for Toronto. Not a great first week. They finished off 1-1. They sit ultimately pretty comfortable at the number 5 seed. But they started going down 0-2 versus the Guerrillas in their very first series. They made the reverse sweep, but when you're going down to a team like LAG, it's never a good position, even though it is a new team. They did lose to the London Royal Ravens in a 3-1 fashion. And in that series, they also started down 0-2. So the opening hard point and the second search destroy, or rather the game 2 S&D, they've not been winning. So far throughout their first 2 games, 1-2 in S&D, 1-3 in hard point. Search destroys are going the distance. The hard points, they're losing by 50 to 60. The one hard point victory that they had was a very slim one at that. And really for Toronto right now, I think the bigger focus is simply just on the SMGs. It is. We've been talking so much about Cammy and Insight. They've got to be top tier. They've got to be better. In Major 3, they absolutely were better. Cammy saw one of the bigger rises in overall KD. Insight was so much sharper when it came down to just clutch situations, when it came down to just being a solid force, and not just S&D, but in the respawns. And so far, we got to talk about the SMGs. I mean, Kleenex, 0.73 versus Guerrillas, a 0.74 versus London, negative 26 versus LAG, negative 24 versus London. Bance had an off performance versus the Ravens as well, a 0.81 versus Trey. You can't have that when you're facing off against your arch nemesis in the EU scene. So I don't think the Paris have a walk in the park schedule. They've got Atlanta and OpTic Texas in 2 of their last 3 games, along with Boston. So they are already in danger of starting in that losers bracket, because if they do lose to the Atlanta FaZe, which, not going to get ahead of myself, most people are going to predict, then they'd find themselves at 1-2 with an OpTic series lined up. That very well could be 1-3, especially with iLLeY back in the team. And who knows from there? You know, if they beat Boston, that means they're at a 2-3 record. What does that mean for Ultra moving forward? Does that mean they could start to lower themselves down the standings? You know, there is a lot on the line already in this game if you are Toronto, because you did allow for that London series to slip. On the other side for Atlanta FaZe, sunny skies, right? Sunny skies. You start off 1-0. You're the number 1 seed. And I said this last week. Now's the time for FaZe to work on their biggest issues. It's to work on the map pool. It's to work on the tendencies. It's to work on, I don't know, rotating in hardpoint type of things. I feel like for the Atlanta crew right now, you're feeling pretty good. Granted, you did go to a game 5 versus the LA Thieves, but from an outside perspective, sometimes LA Thieves are incredible. You just don't really know what Thieves team you're going to get. Unfortunately for Thieves fans, they got a great respawn team, but a horrible search destroy team, right? That team goes 0-6 in both of the hard points. Octane goes, or in the S&Ds, Octane goes 0-6 as well in both of the search destroys. The first double donut that we've seen, I think, in COD history, at least at the highest level, which is rather unfortunate. And while it doesn't feel like Atlanta FaZe are as strong overall, if they could still be tested, they could still, you know, lose hard points, lose controls, go to a game 5. It feels like they are working on the right thing, which is their search and destroy. It feels like that is something that they have to be prioritizing. And I think ultimately long term, it is the right strategy moving ahead. Now, when it comes down to this series, not a great week for Toronto. Not a whole lot of people are going to be high on them. You know, is there a chance that they could make a run versus this FaZe group? I do. I think that there is a very good chance that Toronto could make this a competitive series versus Atlanta. However, these teams have played a number of different times this season, right? I mean, they played twice at Major 3. This is their 6th matchup of the season. And FaZe has won every single time, right? FaZe has won every single time. You know, when you look at this series from afar, FaZe has won every single game 1 that these two teams have played. They've always won the opening hardpoint. The search destroy is where we could talk about Toronto could have a little bit of an attack moment. You get into the control. I think you like FaZe more because it's probably going to be a Tuscan control. Toronto, you know what, they've been able to win Tuscans more often. It feels like Berlin is really that game mode for them, but maybe FaZe decide to pick it if it does end up being their choice. I don't know. I think ultimately this is a 3-1. I think a lot of people could have this as a 3-0, 3-1, or 3-2, depending on how comfortable you think that Toronto can be in this matchup. I feel like it's a difficult one for Toronto. I don't think it changes. I don't think they finally beat Atlanta FaZe now. But I do think that they could put up a fight. I do still. I think that we're not going to see Cammy, or excuse me, I don't think we're going to see Kleenex and Bance have that same type of performance. I think they're going to turn up versus the Atlanta FaZe team and at least get us to a game 4. I think it could go game 5, but I'm going to write this one down as a 3-1 in the books. And say that Toronto win either the S&D or the control. I don't think it's going to be both though. But yeah, I think that Toronto play well. I think this is the best Toronto that we will see, but it still will not be enough. And so Toronto finding themselves already at a 1-2 position, and their fate is going to be decided in that week number 3. Atlanta start things off cool as they have got another game on Saturday. We'll move forward to London versus Minnesota. I was actually looking at this matchup and I was like, wait, I feel like we haven't heard London versus Minnesota in a while, and it actually is true. They have not played since the Major 1, which those teams were different, right? Minnesota had a different crew. London technically did have the same team as they do right now. And on topic with that, the first matchup where they have Gizmo, they look great, right? We just talked about, the team that they beat. They beat Toronto. They looked very, very good in that series. More specifically, 0 looked excellent in that series, put up a 1.58 KD, goes plus 35, has like a 2 hardpoint KD in that series. Excellent W for the Ravens. Now, ultimately, thinking about this big picture, if you're a Ravens fan or just curious on their position, if they do win this, they stand a very good chance of at least going 3-2, because after this series, they've got Florida, they've got Atlanta, and they've got LAG. If you're expecting London to beat Minnesota, you probably like their chances versus Florida, and you probably like their chances versus Guerrillas, which would be 4 Ws. So that is something to really think about. If you are in the Ravens camp, a W versus Minnesota gives you even more confidence, and it sets you up for what will 9 times out of 10 be a winner's bracket position. So I would be comfortable with saying London, if they win this, are going to be in the winner's bracket, even though on paper it wouldn't necessarily say it. Now, in the interview, Gizmo talked about it. He was like, hey, we got our swagger back, and they needed that confidence mightily. We talked about that coming into week 1. We wanted to see London with confidence. We wanted to see them pick up the pace and really just start to get back to where they were previously. And this series, to me, is going to define for London whether or not this team is truly back, right? If they beat Toronto, cool. But if they beat Toronto and they beat Minnesota, they start off 2-0. As we said, they look great to at least get 3, if not 4 wins. Does that mean that London are instantly a top 4 team if they're able to start off with this W? That is something to really think about. As I said, a huge series for London and a very, very big series for Minnesota, not just from an on-paper perspective, but just ultimately from where we view the Røkkr right now, because it feels like a lot of people are ready to jump off of the Røkkr hype train. You know, I know that the fans were kind of frustrated with their performance when it came down to the Toronto Major, given the fact that at Major 3, they go 5-0, 15-3 in overall maps. When it comes to LAN performances, it's just not been there. And, you know, when they do finish at a 1-1 scoreline, they do lose that series to Florida in a 3-0. They did at least take down OpTic Texas, who were not at their best by any stretch of the imagination. But when you do look at their last week, it'd be understandable for you to think that they would go 1-1. The fact that they did it, but just in a different fashion, still doesn't mean that Minnesota are not a good team, if that makes sense. Just because Minnesota had the same scoreline, but just didn't do it in the way that a lot of people predicted, I don't know. It's kind of conflicting to me a little bit. But as I said, for the Røkkr side, it is a huge series when it comes down to seeding. Right, they're trying to get in the top 8. A W here would put them into the top 8, at least momentarily, and be contingent upon LAG's performance versus a few teams versus FaZe and Boston throughout this week. But it's a big one for them. If Minnesota do lose this versus London, that would put them at 1-2, and they stand a very good chance of losing their next series, which would be versus Seattle Surge, and that would put them at 1-3. So for the London side, if you win this, you're feeling so much better because you probably are going 3-2, if not 4-1. If you're Minnesota, you lose this series, you're probably going at least 1-3. So you have a very different pattern going on with both of these rosters. And well, I do feel like that loss that Røkkr had versus the Mutineers was a hard pill to swallow. You have to keep in mind, both the respawns were close. Major was playing with the fire. It is always difficult to play against a team with a new player on it, especially somebody who probably knows all of your strategies, who knows the tendencies. You think Major wasn't watching all of Minnesota's, matches whenever he was not on the team anymore? Of course he was. And obviously, we saw 2Real get very, very comfortable when it came down to the Bocage Search Destroy as well. Which, wait, it wasn't Bocage, right? Did I just say that without thinking? Toronto. Wait, what am I saying? Minnesota versus Florida. It was a Bocage. Okay, I was gonna say, I'm almost positive it was Bocage, but I didn't want to just say that because it popped in my head as Bocage. Like I said, 2Real was feeling a lot more comfortable there. Given the importance and given the one series look from London, I don't know. I feel like we just need a bigger sample size, and I think Røkkr have the ability to take it. I feel like just with the sense of urgency around Minnesota, I think this is going to be a very, very back and forth game. I think it has the potential to go to a game 5. And I'm going to say that it does. I think that it goes to a game 5. I think both these teams show off their talent. We see that London has got what it takes. We see that Minnesota has got what it takes, but I think they just edge them out simply from the search destroy point alone. I think that Røkkr get it done in the final map of the set. And Røkkr stand a chance moving forward. London, not the season, or rather their major is not in a difficult spot, but it definitely doesn't make it as easy of a path. So let's move on to our final matchup of Friday. We've got Boston versus Seattle. Boston are at 1-1 right now, number 6 in the overall standings. A very interesting week in the Boston Breach Chronicles, right? They start off with a crazy reverse sweep versus OpTic Texas. The minds are blown. We're saying, what is going on, right? We didn't know at the time that OpTic Texas was not the OpTic Texas that we thought they were. But it was still a huge W for Breach given the standings, because we talked about it, how Breach had the most difficult schedule basically out of anybody. The fact that they do get through OpTic regardless if they were at full strength or not, those 10 points are massive for Boston moving forward. Then they come into the series versus Thieves. People are high on them. They're like, okay, Boston, maybe they stand a chance versus the Thieves. Granted, they did, get smacked around by them in the last qualifier. Is this one going to be closer? No, it was not. It was the exact same type of series, a 3-0. Not as dominant, but still a 3-0 is a 3-0, and I think they basically walked over every map pretty comfortably. So, for the Boston side, we went from thinking, okay, Nero and Vivid, are they one of the scariest duos that we've got in the league? To wait, are Boston back to their old ways already? Rather unfortunate if you are a Boston Breach fan. And I feel like for Boston right now too, they're kind of figuring out what their path is, because it used to be Reliance needed to go off, right? Reliance needed to go off, and let's hope that we can just dominate in the search destroys, and that is how they got through a lot of their series. Now with the new team in play, it feels like the S&Ds are no longer guaranteed anymore. Methodz has obviously taken a step back from being the number 1 KD player in the league. And now with the SMGs, the craziness that you have, do you want to transfer from playing the Berlins and more specifically the Gavutus to the Tuskens and the Bokages of the world? I mean, it feels like the priorities, the identity for Boston needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved very quickly. The problem being is that they're going to try to figure it out versus a team like Seattle Surge, who looked excellent in their very, very first matchup of the Major 4 qualifiers. It sounds weird to say, but a statement win versus the Legion is up there, right? Paris had a lot of noise going around that team. What they were able to do in practice. We saw tweet after tweet, screenshot after screenshot of them beating up teams in the CDL, saying how they were, going to be the Reapers. They were going to end some teams' hopes at getting into that top 8. And the fact that Seattle came in and just never really gave them a chance, more specifically, Pred did, was very, very important and interesting to watch. Pred goes for a 1.54 in that series, plus 26 overall. Sim and accuracy look great. They go for plus 26 combined as well. Pred nearly drops a 2 KD on the cage, 39 and 21. He did get countered by Johnny in the Bokaj Search Destroy a decent amount, but then went on in the control to finish off 31 and 20. To be honest, Seattle, a great victory, and I feel like that W, like I said, it is versus Paris, but I feel like it further cemented into everybody's mind that Seattle are still one of the top dogs in the game. And given, OpTic's trajectory, they're kind of up in the air. Toronto, where do they stand right now? It feels like Seattle are the easy team to just call as the runner-up to Atlanta FaZe for top dogs in the game. And considering that Seattle beat Atlanta FaZe not once but twice at the Major 3 tournament, it says a lot about them. It says a lot about Seattle, and it almost essentially says this team is almost in that top tier, if not already there. We just haven't seen it yet. And it feels like right now Pred very well could be the best SMG in the game. He could be the best sub that we've got in the game at this current moment. I know we could talk about Shotzzy, we could talk about a few different players, but at this current moment, the impact that he's able to have on the map, just his sheer, I don't even know what the word would be, but just what he's able to do in every life is so important. And you can see Seattle seeing the benefits from that. And obviously a team like Paris, who have been playing great in scrimmages, got very much hurt by the fact that Pred was dominating them when it came down to the respawns. Now, this is going to be an interesting series to check out, specifically from Boston, right? Because they can go, or they're going rather, to throw their team out versus one of the scariest slang trios that we've got in the entirety of the CDL. We could see a Bokaj, very possible. Both teams do like these smaller respawns, and I think this new Boston team is going to like to play in that environment as well. So we very well could see a Bokaj, we could see a Tusken, whether it comes down, or whether a crazy Berlin control as well. Now, to me in this series, it really is a David versus Goliath type of battle. I think that without question, Seattle are going to be the favorites. And if you're Breach, you have to rely on winning the search destroys if they want to stand a chance in this series. If Boston does win this, they'd have a chance of sneaking into the top 7, top 8 at the major, as their next series would be versus LAG, and that means they could reach the 3-win target. So Boston wins this series. That to me is unbelievable. It defines a lot for Breach. It says a lot about Seattle. Maybe they're not that elite team. They still can lose to, bottom of the barrel rosters from time to time. It would finally at least erase the stigma for a moment that Boston cannot beat solid rosters, because, well, they did beat OpTic Texas. It wasn't OpTic at their full strength. It feels like they were the worst that they have been probably this season. So it would finally kind of remove that, if you will, from the Breach, and would give them their biggest debut of the season, considering, like we said, that getting into the winners would mean everything for this Boston Breach team. If they could have those 2 Ws and then have that one series versus LAG that could get them over the hump, that would say everything. I'm selling the dream, though. I'm selling the dream because I think this is going to be a 3-1 series. I do. I think that Seattle coming to this, they handle business. I think Boston gives it their all. I think because it's we're going to see a lot of small maps. It could be a Boston W on, an opening hardpoint, maybe an S&D. I don't think the control probably goes their way, but I think that we do see Boston at least take 1. But that is it at the end of the day. I don't think it's going to be more than that. Seattle move forward, and Boston, well, they drop to one of the best teams in the game. Let's move forward to our first game on Saturday. London taking on Florida. Florida are 1-1 right now. They are in the number 10th spot in the overall standings. Had a big spotlight on them at week number 1, right? They suffered their first series loss versus New York, and then later had a 3-0 win versus Røkkr, Major Maniac, and the revenge game was a man on fire versus the old squad. And it feels like, to me, the primary issue that I've noticed for Florida, I know we're jumping right into this, but the primary issue that I've noticed for Florida is that I feel like it is all going to come down to Major's performance, because the small sample size that we have, it doesn't feel like Too Real is going to be the unbelievable, explosive player who's going to take over and respawns. It feels like maybe at best he could be somebody who has a map every once in a while, but ultimately is better in the SDs. But I feel like a lot of it's going to come down to Major. I feel like there is a lot of pressure on Florida, given the fact that on paper they have the easiest schedule, but also because if you are Florida, you need to have a third option along with Big Wake and along with Skies. So there needs to be a third option a lot of the time. You need to make sure the IGL, right? He is the IGL of the team. You need to make sure that everybody is on, everybody's good to go, ready to move forward. And then also you need to make sure the S&Ds are looking solid, because that is the reason why these 2 players were added. They were added because of Search Destroy in mind. And so that's why I feel like there's a lot on Major Maniac's plate, because not only does he need to play well, be efficient, but also needs to be a great in-game leader. And when it comes down to the respawns and in Search Destroy, he has to be at the top of his game as well. He was able to do all of those things when it came down to Minnesota, but can he do that consistently across all series? Obviously not. It just depends on how often that's going to be there. We saw some moments of brilliance, right, from that Minnesota series, but I just don't know if it's going to be consistent enough, right? Are you going to be able to have Too Real go 19-33 and walk away with close hardpoint victories again? Probably not, right? That's what happened in that opening Tuscan versus Minnesota. The respawns were very, very close in that set. It most likely doesn't go that way again, especially, like I said, when it comes down to Major Maniac playing against his prior team. So it is interesting times for Florida. We'll see how they play. Now, I do have London off of a loss versus Minnesota. It very well could be them at 2-0. Really is going to come down, like I said, to what I believe is a game 5. But I definitely could see London taking that series versus Røkkr. Regardless of the win regardless of the win or the loss to Røkkr, I have London beating the Mutineers no matter what. I do. I have London taking it regardless of how that first series goes. If they beat Røkkr, I think they beat Mutineers. If they still lose to Røkkr, I think they still beat the Mutineers. I think from the Ravens, from matchup perspective, it's still hard to judge with Gizmo right now. But I feel like from the talent perspective, from the slang perspective, I feel like Afro and Nasty are going to be too difficult to deal with. I think that Trey played some great COD last week. And I think Gizmo is going to be playing much better as well. And so I think from all of those areas, if London come out and they steal the first hard point, you instantly are scared. Now, the big thing for Florida is that, as we said, with these 2 new players, it cannot just be, the first hard point type of team that Mutineers have been for so long. They're going to have to finally be a team that can rely on those search destroys with the new players in mind. So that is something to think about when it comes down to this series is if London do go up 1-0, can Florida answer back, right? Can they finally rely on that S&D that has plagued them so much throughout the season? I ultimately don't think that it will, and I think the Ravens walk away with this series in a 3-1 fashion. A huge loss for Florida to take. As we said, trying to rise up in the standings, trying to overtake Minnesota, get into the top 8 the best way that they can. A loss here versus London puts them back that much further. Let's move forward. Paris versus OpTic Texas. Paris officially out of champs. Were humbled in the 3-0 loss that they suffered versus Seattle. Question that I had: if they lose early, would they start to lose some of that motivation that is still left in the tank? With the roster move, I think it's fair to say there is definitely the wind taken out of their sails a decent amount. In that 3-0 loss. So I do think there is a bit of that there. At the same time, when you bring in Johnny, I mean, he looked great in the S&D. It's hard to judge a player's performance when he's only played one series and more specifically gets 3-0'd by one of the best teams in the game. So it's difficult to call. Obviously, he looked great in the Bocage. He was able to slow down Pred, take him down in a lot of those early engagements. But that's really all that we have to go off of. The story really for me in this series is obviously going to be onto OpTic Texas. They are 0-2 right now, which is going to be a shame. But Ender is back, right? iLLeY is finally going to be making his comeback for the first time since Pro-Am, right? It's been happening since like the very first week of May, leading up into the Pro-Am. There was talks about, is he going to play? Is he not going to play? It sounds like he has an injury. We figure out he does have an injury. We're told that he's going to come back. Doesn't end up happening. We're told he's going to come back again when it comes down to the start of Major 4. That doesn't happen. First 2 games of Pro Loot do not go well. And now it sounds like he is ready to play. And the short videos that I've been able to see, it sounds like Rambo has said that it feels like the reason why it was caused is because of the way that iLLeY likes to hold his controller. He's tried to make those adjustments and now he's holding it a slightly different way. And so, that is something to, I guess, think about when it comes down to the set, when it comes down to the series, is how's iLLeY going to play, right? Having this time off, how is he going to play? How's he going to perform? I think when you do look at this for OpTic Texas's perspective, you couldn't really ask for a better start. I mean, you really couldn't. You couldn't ask for a better first matchup than to face off against the Paris Legion. This is the ultimate opportunity to figure out, okay, let's everybody, let's figure out how to play with iLLeY back in the lineup. Let's figure out how to get back to that same team that we were at Major 1, the same team that was number 1 in the power rankings for the longest of times. How do we bring that same team back? And so I feel like this first series versus Paris is going to be a great opportunity. Now, I will say, if Paris do take down OpTic Texas, starting off 0-3, will put OpTic most likely in the losers bracket. So that is something to be somewhat cautious about. You do not want to take Paris lightly. As we said, despite losing 3-0 to Seattle, they were looking great when it came down to scrimmages leading into Major 4. So I think that Paris are going to give it their best shot. You are a team that basically is fighting for your life. It feels like maybe even for your career moving into next year at this point. So I think that Paris, all the players are going to be playing their best COD that they can. I don't ultimately think that that's going to be enough. So I think OpTic do walk away with this series, but I think it is going to be in a 3-1. I think Paris take 1 map. Maybe they take 2. But again, if you are in OpTic's shoes, you're not very worried about that. You're just trying to make sure that iLLeY plays well. You're just trying to make sure that the comms are flowing, that you're getting back into the right state of mind. I think every single moment that goes by leading into this week is huge for OpTic to make sure that iLLeY is back in the comms, back in the scrimmages, making sure that everything sounds great. And I think more specifically, just making sure that the game plan is what they want it to be. So let's move forward. OpTic takes down Paris. We move into New York versus Seattle. This is a must-win, or rather a must-watch and a must-win type of series. This is huge when it comes down to seeding overall. This is a rematch from Major 3. If you remember that matchup, it went down like this. Seattle, we're up 2-0. New York came back, managed to force the game 5. We're up 5-3 on the Tuscan S&D and lost it in a round 11 1v1. Crazy series, one of the more wilder ones that we've seen this year, and probably one of the best series that we saw at the Toronto home series. And if you're New York, as we like to talk about, we made a video about it. The spotlight is on them to make the run. They have to finish at least 4-1 in the Major 4 qualifiers, and that still may not be enough depending on how the rest of the teams start to perform around the rest of the league. They did the job they had to in week 1, right? They're able to go 2-0. They win those games in a 3-1 fashion versus Florida, versus LAG. It's not necessarily a week that you write home about, but it definitely solidified the fact that, okay, the journey is here, right? The journey actually starts right now, it feels like, for the New York Subliners. Those W's were just to get you to this point where you can actually stand a chance. The fact that they've been able to do that now puts the path forward. Seattle, OpTic, LAT. You gotta win 2 out of those 3, and all 3 of those are by no means guaranteed for the Subliners. So in my eyes, New York, without a doubt, right, have got to at least go 1-1. Obviously, you'd love to go 2-0. 0-2 is not an option. You gotta at least go 1-1 this week. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Whether that's versus Seattle or versus OpTic, one of them has to be a W. Now, I have gone pretty in depth with this coverage over Seattle from the New York's perspective. And the way that I would view this series from NYSL's perspective, if you were to give bullet points on what needs to be done, is this. Play Seattle on as big of a map as you can and ultimately play well in the search and destroys. Play them on the big maps and take advantages in the S&Ds is really what this is going to come down to. If New York, really to give New York a chance is what I'm trying to say. Now, what's interesting about Seattle, the reason why I say play them on the big maps is because of this. These are the names of the most recent hardpoint maps that Seattle have won. Are you ready? Bocage, Tuscan, Bocage, Tuscan, Tuscan, Bocage, Bocage, Berlin, Tuscan, Tuscan, Bocage. I think there's a pattern, right? I think there's a pattern with the way that Seattle's seeing success in the hard points. It's by playing Bocage. It's by playing Tuscan, right? It's by playing and dominating on the smaller maps in the game. With a team that has this kind of pace, you want to see that slang trio go off and play at a very, very rapid speed. The thing for New York is, I don't think that you feel comfortable enough to try to match them against that. So I think that you want to play them on the bigger maps, play them on the Berlins, play them on the Kavutsus of the world is going to be your best chance of realistically trying to take down Seattle Surge. Now, I get, right, teams trying to play their own game, and that very well could come into this series, right? But just to me, I feel like if you are New York, it's no more about playing our game. It is trying to hard counter the other roster. And ultimately, if I'm New York, I am preparing for both of these matchups, more specifically for Seattle, the best way possible, right? I'm scrimming on the maps that we intend on playing in this set over and over and over and over again. Because they lose to Seattle, then they got to be perfect, right? If they lose versus the Surge, they have got to be perfect, not lose to OpTic, not lose to LA Thieves, and then at that point, still have to finish arguably top 3 at least when it comes down to the major. So I feel like you toss aside all of this, we're going to play our game type of mentality. We're going to play the maps that we really want to. No, I don't think so at all. I think you do your best to play them on as big of a map as you can. Slow down the pace and the speed of Seattle. Don't allow for Pred to get comfortable. Don't allow for Mack to get comfortable, right? Those two are the players that I look out for most on Seattle when it comes down to dominant runs. And I think for New York, right? Seattle have yet to win a Kavutsu hardpoint this season. I highly doubt that Surge leave that in. If they do, New York absolutely takes it. If I am New York, though, I'm playing most likely in this set Bocage and Berlin. I'm most likely playing Bocage and Berlin. The reason for that is Seattle get rid of Kavutsu. You definitely want to have Berlin in the set. And because of such, you probably take Tuscan out of the picture because, as we said, you want to play them on Bocage or do you want to play them on Tuscan? I think from New York's perspective, given their history of being a great Bocage team right back at the Pro-Am when everybody was unaware of the fact of how great they looked, I think you try that again. Now, when these two teams did play, like I said, when it came down to Major 3, the opening hardpoint wasn't Bocage and it was a Seattle W. But again, I feel like you're willing to test the waters more. Like, I would absolutely test the waters if I am the New York Subliners. I'm happy to play a Bocage versus Seattle Surge because, again, Bocage can be wild. Bocage can be crazy. I am more than willing to give that one a go. I feel like Tuscan is a little too risky. That's the reason why I play Bocage over Tuscan. On the other side, again, who knows how the vetoes could work. Maybe Seattle decide to get rid of Berlin. I think instead they'll get rid of Kavutsu. And obviously New York are very well fit when it comes down to a Berlin hardpoint. So they'll be happy to play them on Berlin. And I feel like from a Bocage perspective, you'll take that if you are NYSL. So I think that's where the hardpoints are going to look if you are in New York's position. Now, like I said, you got to beat them in the SMDs. You got to take advantages of the opportunities that you're given. If you go up 1-0 in the hardpoint, you're in a great spot. If you do lose that opening hardpoint on a Bocage, for example, you can't afford to go down 0-2 versus this Seattle team. So like I said, New York, the story for this team throughout the year has been in search destroy. It has been in those overtime round 11 type of positions. If they're not winning round 11s, they're in a bad spot. If they are winning round 11s, it feels like everything is wonderful. Everything's in a great position. So I feel like, again, you want to play them in those hard points. You got to take at least one of the search destroys. Obviously, if we go to a game 5, somebody's got to win it. And then when it comes into control, Seattle hate Gavutu. They haven't played it since Major 2, so that's going to be out of the picture. And if you are New York, it's up in the air. Do you want to play Berlin or do you want to play Tuscan? On paper, I'd rather see Seattle on Tuscan because I feel like you can get to a guaranteed round 5. At the same time, for New York, they struggle on offense on Tuscan. Very, very bad. Like, I think it's like 7%, if not lower than that, when it comes down to their attacks. Seattle is a great team historically when it comes down to attacking. So would you rather face off against them on Berlin, right, where everything is crazy? You never really know what's going to happen on Berlin. Or would you rather see them on Tuscan, where you arguably aren't going to get a whole lot? So it comes down to this, right? If New York is going to rely on themselves, they go with a Berlin. Or I don't know how to, actually, I don't know how I would explain this. It'd be more of New York either relies on their offense on Berlin or their defense on Tuscan. Whichever one they feel more comfortable in is the choice that I would make. I know I talked about it. You know, maybe I'd rather see them play on Tuscan. It's hard to call because, again, if Seattle gets that one tick, then that puts them in a great position for round 5 to have the defense. But ultimately, if you are the Subliners, I think you choose Tuscan, but they very well could choose Berlin. And when they played at Major 3, New York did beat them on Berlin control. So that is something to think about. So, you know, there is a lot to consider. There is a lot to, you know, eye up when it comes down to this series. I just think that the writing is on the wall. You know, when it comes down to New York, it's to play the big maps, play as big of maps as possible. It's to take advantages of the S&Ds. Do not lose in round 11 overtime situations. And then if you do have the ability to choose the control, are you going to rely on your defense on Tuscan or your offense on Berlin? That is the way this one is going to line out. That to me is the pathway that you do, that you have to walk through if you want to beat the Seattle Surge. Now, can they do it? Is it possible, right? Seattle, they are 2-0 with wins over Paris and Boston. They have 3 difficult series next versus NYSL, Minnesota, and Atlanta. So if Seattle do lose this, they've got Minnesota and Atlanta waiting on them. It's a big one, but I do think New York get their redemption. I think by either winning the opening hardpoint or the game 2 S&D, I think they win the control and they're ultimately up 2-1 moving into game 4, and they close it out in the game 5, if not in the game 4. I think this one ends in a 5-game set. I think it's a wild series. Again, I understand, right? I totally understand. Seattle, one of the best teams that we have in the game. I just think the sense of urgency is there. I feel like if you're the Subliners, you are giving everything that you have got for this matchup. You're giving everything that you have for this set. I very well could revisit this and be like, nope, I'm changing my prediction. I'm going back on what I said. It's possible, okay? I could do that. But I just think that given that pathway, it feels possible for me. It does. It feels like NYSL do stand a chance if they're able to do those very same things. And a lot of it to me comes down to what we saw at Major 3, where they were able to make a comeback, force that game 5, and they should have beaten this team at Major 3. They should have beaten this team at Major 3. They were up 5-3 in the game 5 search destroy. It should have happened. But like I said, again, those clutch moments got away from them. And who knows, right? If New York beats Seattle, that guarantees them 20 points. That puts them in a great position. Seattle maybe doesn't win Major 3. Maybe New York goes on a run. And New York are probably in a much better position when it comes down to these qualifiers. I think New York get their redemption, and they somehow, some way, walk away with this series. All right. Let us move forward. The dream is alive for New York, at least for now. LAG versus Atlanta. LAG 0-2, number 8 seed. Very scary time. Very scary time for the Guerrillas. They could be in the 9th seed, I believe, at this point, contingent upon Minnesota's performance in the earlier matchup versus London. Scary spot for the LA Guerrillas. They're off the 3-2 loss versus Toronto after going up 2-0. Felt good about them despite the loss. They win in versus NYSL, a revenge game for Neptune. They lose 3-1. It just feels like the decisions that LAG made are not manifesting the way that they expected. Honestly, for LAG, it just feels like they don't have an identity. Like, they want a hard point, they want to search, destroy, and they want to control this prior week. It was like there was nothing that was consistent. You didn't have like one player going off. It wasn't like, hey, they look great in this mode, but they just got to work on this. It feels like for LAG, they are still trying to discover themselves. And the problem is that they're 0-2 facing off against the Atlanta FaZe that arguably is going to put them in the loser's bracket already. Going down 0-3 would not be a good position for this LAG group. I think that Guerrillas, when it comes down to this series, show a bit of life. But I think that Atlanta, who would be 2-0 at this point, they go now 3-0 overall to start off Major 4 for them. It's going to be a great opportunity for them to test the map pool a little bit, work on some areas that need improvement. But I think this is a 3-0, if not 3-1. I think LAG do show some life. You know what? I'm going to say it's a 3-0. I'm just going to say it's a 3-0. I've got a lot of 3-1 predictions. We need to have at least one sweep in week number 2, and I think it's going to be this series. It's unfortunate. I hate it because I did like the decision that LAG made. I feel like they probably long-term should have kept the seam, but I did like the idea of bringing Spark back. I think, the scouting that they did to bring in Neptune was great. It's just not good enough right now. And it's a scary time. Like I said, if you are LAG, you're the team that is sliding the most right now. It feels like Boston has a little bit of their bearings. LAT are in a pretty good spot overall. The Guerrillas are starting to decline. And I just don't know how it's going to go. I really don't. And then we jump into our next series, LAG versus Boston. This is huge, right? Because both of these teams are looking at this, coming into this matchup and thinking, this has to be a W, right? They circled this series on their schedule and said, we have got to win this game. Boston, they've already got one W, and they desperately need another one. This would be arguably both teams' easiest matchup by far this split, at least on paper. I have Guerrillas 0-3 coming into this back-to-back series. Without a doubt, in my opinion, are going to be 0-3 coming into this. I just don't see a plan of attack where they beat Atlanta FaZe. Maybe they channel some of that Major 2 craziness, but I still don't think that's possible. And then when it comes to Boston, right, I do have them off of a loss versus Seattle. Again, I think a lot of people are going to expect that. So this is most likely an 0-3 LAG versus a 1-2 Boston. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, because it could be different, but I highly doubt it. Now, it's hard to give them a chance. Boston, right, in that series post-LA Thieves, it's hard to really write a whole lot about Boston just to say that they can come out and win a series versus, I don't know, some top caliber rosters in the game. However, they're not facing off against top caliber roster in the game, right? They're facing off against the Guerrillas. This is going to be a battle of the SMGs. I feel like Vivid and Nero versus Neptune and Hook. It's going to be a fun game to watch. I think it very well could go down to the wire, but I think that Boston are ultimately going to take it in 4. I think they win it in a 3-1 fashion. I just feel like LAG are somewhat lifeless. They're gonna lose to Atlanta FaZe most likely. They're gonna come into this game, maybe lose the opening hard point, and I feel like from there's just not a whole lot of life with this Guerrillas team. I think there is some signs of improvement, and if LAG do win this, that would be huge, especially for the teams who are in the bottom of the barrel right now. If you are trying to view this from an outside perspective, if LAG is at least able to take down Boston with them, that does give a chance for some of the teams who are in the bottom 4. At the same time, any W for Guerrillas is huge. Any W for Boston is huge. I think the Breach walk away this week in a 1-1 fashion and are in the 20-point range. They have indeed earned 20 points when it comes down to these qualifiers, which who thought that was even possible? I don't know. We'll move on to Paris Legion versus the LA Thieves. I'll be honest. I think it's going to be an LA Thieves W. I do. It could be a great opportunity for Paris to play spoilers. Again, they are going to be off the series versus OpTic Texas. I just think that LAT are going to come in. They're going to feel good. They're going to feel confident and comfortable. It's hard to write anything about Paris right now. I think there could be an opportunity to attack in the S&D. You know, there could be an opportunity to make something happen in an early hard point. I don't know. It's hard to define really what the motive is right now for Paris. If they've had that drive right now at this moment, it's really hard to know where Paris sit mentality wise, you know, what the roster ultimately looks like, especially after a loss versus OpTic Texas. It's just a rough moment right now for LA Thieves, or rather for Paris Legion facing off against the LA Thieves. If Paris were to take down LAT here, though, again, that has massive implications when it comes down to the overall standings, and what would be a guaranteed, you know, W. If you are LA Thieves coming into this week, you're thinking, hey, you know, we've got that, you know, that W versus Paris basically lined up. If that doesn't happen, there could be some chaos that does occur, but I don't think it will happen here. I think Paris win one map versus OpTic, and they win one map versus Thieves, but that will be it. Now, let us talk about the last series of week number 2, NYSL versus OpTic Texas. Massive game, right? Massive game. I have New York at 3-0 coming into this game versus OpTic Texas, who is 1-2. Yeah, who would have thought? OpTic Texas do get the W versus Paris. I think that is guaranteed. New York, that is not guaranteed by any means. New York very well could come into this matchup with a 2-1 score line. And as we said, New York, they've got to at least finish 4-1 when it comes down to these qualifiers. If they lose to Seattle, they cannot lose to OpTic, and they cannot lose their next week matchup versus the LA Thieves. It's interesting times because, as I said, it's contingent upon this series. If New York beats Seattle and they come into this matchup versus OpTic with some momentum, I mean, imagine if they beat OpTic, you probably expect them to beat LA Thieves again next week, which means they can go 5-0, do well and above what anybody expected. At the same time, if they lose to Seattle, this series, arguably, and again, arguably, you got to be careful with the wording because it's still possible, but most likely would be the dagger in the subliner season. Right there. That would decide the entire year of New York. That series could possibly eliminate Crim, eliminate New York from a good chance at getting to champs, which is wild. Like, that is so wild to think about. These teams do obviously have a lot of history, right? We talk about, you know, Scump versus Crim. The king is dead, right? When it came down to Major 3, New York desperately needed a W, right? Because they had a 2-2 record in that series. They needed to have a winner's bracket spot. They were able to beat OpTic Texas in order to have that. Shotzzy had an off series. I remember more specifically, Hydra and Crim looked great in that matchup. They might need it again, right? They might need that same magic again versus OpTic Texas. Now, I'm going to go off of the fact that I do have New York beating Seattle in that game 5. So in my prediction, it is not a must win technically, but I really do feel like it's a 50-50 call. It is a 50-50 call. I think the sense of urgency, you know, is going to be there for New York regardless. But if they are off of a win versus Seattle, you're not going to have that same worry or that same concern, you know, in facing off against OpTic, depending on how those situations go. Now, this will also be OpTic's second series with iLLeY being in the lineups, or they're being in the lineup. They'll finally kind of have their bearings, if you will. You know, they'll finally have some moments to practice. They'll kind of get everything back on track, and then they head right into that subliner series the very next day. I think that New York this week goes 1-1. I do. I think that New York either loses to Seattle and beats OpTic, or beats Surge and loses to OpTic. I don't know which one it's going to be. I think that, you know, from the game plan that I listed, I think that New York beat Surge, but OpTic beat New York in the 3-1 or 3-2. I don't know. I kind of want to call this a game 5 because I just feel like, again, iLLeY second series with OpTic Texas, a big matchup just in general for both of these teams, because if you are OpTic as well, the sense of urgency is there for you too, because you cannot afford to lose another game. If you do, you are guaranteed going to be in the losers bracket. Or I shouldn't say guaranteed, but you're in a very, very likely spot to be in the losers bracket. If OpTic loses this, they're 1-3 with the best case scenario of going 2-3. And then it comes down to map pool, or rather it comes down to map win percentage. It comes down to maybe getting the 7th or 8th seed at best. So whoever loses this series is going to have some major repercussions. The way that I have it playing out, right, like I said, is that New York beat Seattle in the biggest of moments. They beat them in a game 5. They covered that series versus OpTic. Texas do start to get back into form because I think with iLLeY, they are going to get back into a top tier form. It's just a matter of time in my eyes. And that is the way that this goes. Again, I know a lot of people are going to probably have these flip-flopped. You know, Seattle beat New York. New York ends up beating OpTic. It's just the way that I think from a matchup perspective, it's all going to play out. It's going to be madness. It's going to be crazy. I'm absolutely going to love every single second of it. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this week of LandO's Lock-ins. Before we do go, though, I do want to show you a quick graphic. We did this at the end of the last episode, and we're going to do it again. So, if my predictions are indeed accurate, which again, these are not the standings right now. These are the standings with Landon's predictions from week number 2 thrown in. So you can see the impacts that it would make if these matchups all are in fact true, which as we said, is very well, or very likely may not 100% be accurate. But if they are, Atlanta's still firmly at the top, 10 points away from 300. OpTic still sitting firmly in that 2nd seed. Seattle still in 3rd. London still in 4th. But take a look at what happens, right? Toronto now have got some company, right? They've got some neighbors who've decided to join them in the 150 camp. Boston, because of the series victory that they had versus OpTic last week, now it promotes them to getting 20 points because they beat LAG this week. So by doing that, that puts them at 150. And who knows with Toronto, as I said, you know, when it comes down to overall points, they have the ability to fall. Toronto have got to be very careful about their position because if they lose versus Atlanta FaZe, that is no points for this week. And you are looking forward, you know, when it comes down to week number 3, you have got matchups versus OpTic Texas. And like I said, and versus Boston Breach as well. So you've got those 2 games that you got to very much be thinking about. So Toronto and Boston meet each other at 150. LAT are at 140, still in that 7th seed. But take a look at Minnesota. They overtake LAG. So very, very interesting moments. Minnesota do eclipse the top 8 with a W versus London. LAG, if they lose to FaZe and they lose to Boston, they do not have an opportunity to put up points. If they do, though, that would be massive, right? If LAG beats Boston, for example, that would be totally different. Minnesota would still be in that 9th spot. LAG would then be at 135, just 5 points ahead into the top 8. And like I said, that extra 5 points, right? That little bit that you get from winning a major means a lot. And then just below LAG, 5 points behind, in fact, are Florida at 120. New York, not far away, right? Not far away by any means at 100 points. Paris still at the very bottom with 20. So like I said, Florida 10 points away, New York 30 points away from top 8, but 10 away from the Mutineers and 15 from the 9th seed. LAG have London, so that most likely, or rather, let me say this way. The Guerrillas, right, when it comes down to next week, have, I think, let me take a look here. LAG have London next week, so that most likely means that they're going to stay at 125. Next week, Florida have got Paris and Thieves. They most likely go 1-1 and get to 130. So if you are New York, if they're able to beat LA Thieves, which like I said, going off of my predictions, I think New York go 1-1. If New York do finish off, which like we said, they have to go 4-1, they would reach 110 points. And it is a raise for those who are in the top 8 of the major. And I guess, or I don't know. It is somewhat of a raise ultimately for New York, but at the same time, if Florida do go 1-1, they're still going to be 20 points behind. So it's going to be a race. It's going to be a race overall in the top 8 to see who can stay there. In the bottom 4, it's really going to be, can Florida and New York and maybe LAG, but probably Florida and New York, can they overtake some of these teams? Is Minnesota going to stay solid? Is LAT going to stay solid? Is Boston going to fall right after that W they got versus OpTic and probably a W versus LAG this week? Did that just give them enough? Did that just give them enough points to hold off what is going to have to be a crazy, crazy finish at the New York Major? Folks, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for tuning into this week of LandO's Lock-ins. Appreciate you guys for tuning in so much. Hope you enjoyed the predictions. We did lock things in as well, so these predictions are 100% official Feel free to let me know down in the comments. Did you agree with my picks? Did you disagree with my picks? What things would you have done differently? Do you think that New York are going to do what they're going to be able to do? Is OpTic going to be able to perform versus NYSL? I don't know. Is Florida going down a little bit? Is Toronto going down a little bit? What's going to happen with London? What's going to happen with Boston? What's going to happen with LA Thieves? Who knows? Feel free to let me know down in the comments. If you've not done so already, make sure to like the video and subscribe, and I will see you guys all next week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the broadcast. Major 4, week 2. It's about to be crazy. Thanks again, guys. See you later.